My hands were steady. They had been steady for 19 years. I had opened sealed stone chambers in basilicas across Umbria, in crypts beneath Florence, in cold underground chapels where the air tasted of centuries. My hands had never once trembled. They trembled on April 9th, 2019. I was standing in the lower chapel of the Sanctuary of the Spoliation in Assisi, 2 meters from the open tomb of Carlo Acutis, and I could not make myself step forward. The lead seal was broken. The marble had been shifted. The space was lit by a portable halogen lamp I had set up myself 30 minutes earlier, angled precisely at 22 degrees to give maximum visibility to the interior. I had done everything right. And then I looked at the hands. That was 4 years before his canonization, before Pope Leo XIV stood in St. Peter's Square and said his name before 200,000 people, before anyone else in the world knew what I had seen in that chapel on that Tuesday morning in April. I had been carrying it alone, and the weight of it, the specific, measurable, undeniable weight of what those hands showed me, had been the heaviest thing I ever carried in my professional life. My name is Dr. Elena Marchetti. I have been a conservator and sacred art restorer for 27 years. I hold a doctorate in conservation science from the University of Bologna, a secondary certification in forensic material analysis from the Opificio della Pietra Dure in Florence, and I have participated in 11 canonical cause investigations on behalf of the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints. I am not a mystic. I am a scientist who spends her days measuring the decay of organic material. I have documented the decomposition of 43 relics across 9 countries. I know what matter does when it is left to its own devices inside a sealed stone enclosure. What I found in that tomb did not obey any device I own. But here is what nobody knows, what I have never told publicly until this recording. Before I went into that chapel in 2019, I was carrying something Carlo had given me. Not directly, through his mother, Antonia. A folded piece of paper inside a small brown envelope, sealed with a strip of ordinary clear tape, with 4 words written on the outside in blue ballpoint pen. 4 words I read 100 times over 13 years without opening what was inside, because Antonia had told me, when you know what it means, open it. For 13 years, I had no idea what it meant. I carried it in the inner breast pocket of my work jacket every single day I stepped into a church on professional business. A habit, a superstition, something I could not explain even to myself. 3 things happened in that chapel that I cannot account for scientifically. The first I will tell you now. The second you will understand only after I explain what the temperature readings showed in the weeks that followed. And the third requires the envelope to be opened first, and I did not open it until the night of October 12th, 2020, 14 years to the day after Carlo died. For 3 years after that night, I stayed silent. Today, I tell it all. I did not grow up religious. My father was a structural engineer from Bologna who built bridges and believed in compressive loads. My mother taught secondary school biology and kept Darwin on the shelf next to the dictionary. The churches I walked into as a child were cathedrals of measurement. I was taught to see the vault height, the thickness of the travertine, the optical correction in the column spacing. Sacred architecture fascinated me as engineering. The faith inside it was other people's business. I came to conservation through chemistry. My undergraduate thesis at Bologna was on the rate of alkaline hydrolysis in medieval oil-based pigments. My doctoral work was on microbiological colonization of Romanesque fresco surfaces, specifically how the presence of Bacillus cereus in limestone affects the rate of chromatic loss. Numbers, curves on a graph. That was my world, and I liked its rules. My stance on the supernatural was simple and honestly held. I had never encountered anything in 27 years of examining ancient sacred objects that could not be explained by time, biology, and humidity. Not once. I had seen purported incorruptible relics that were anything but. wax coverings, arsenic preservation, deliberate manipulation of burial conditions. I had written 2 peer-reviewed papers on false incorruptibility claims. I was, to put it plainly, exactly the wrong person to be standing in Carlo Acutis' tomb. And yet, the assignment came through official channels on March 14, 2019. I received a letter from the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints, signed by the relator of Carlo's cause, requesting my participation in the formal recognition of the body. This is a canonical procedure required by church law before a beatification can proceed. My role was specific: material analysis of the physical remains, documentation of the state of preservation, technical report on the condition of the burial environment. Standard work. I had done it 10 times before. I accepted without hesitation because there was nothing about it that should have required anything more than my equipment, my methodology, and 12 to 15 hours of professional attention. I arrived in Assisi on April 7, 2019, 2 days before the formal recognition was scheduled to begin. I always arrive early for this work. 48 hours to conduct preliminary environmental readings in the space: temperature, relative humidity, particulate concentration, carbon dioxide levels. I use a Testo 435-4 multifunction instrument for ambient conditions, and a Sensirion STS-40 calibrated probe for surface temperature mapping of the burial chamber walls. On April 7th, at 6:47 in the evening, the internal temperature of the lower chapel registered 17.3 degrees Celsius, relative humidity 61%. Both readings consistent with what I would expect for an underground limestone chapel in central Umbria in early April. Normal, entirely predictable. On April 8, the readings were the same, within half a degree. I set up my documentation equipment. I reviewed the custody records for the tomb. Carlo had been buried there since 2007, initially in a simple grave, his body placed inside a standard zinc coffin with a hermetic seal, then enclosed within a marble surround. 12 years of sealed conditions. I had the seal integrity report from the stonemason who had managed the site, and it showed no evidence of breach at any point in the 12 years. The tomb was clean, uncontaminated from outside air. The conditions were as close to a controlled environment as you get in an active pilgrimage site. April 9th, 6:30 in the morning. I was in the chapel alone, which was how I preferred to conduct the first opening. 2 other members of the recognition team, a medical examiner from Perugia named Dr. Gianluca Ferretti, and the canonical postulator assigned to the cause, were scheduled to arrive at 9. I had 3 hours to conduct my preliminary surface assessment before the formal procedure began. At 6:51, I broke the lead seal. I registered the time, as required. I noted the ambient temperature, 17.1 degrees Celsius, essentially unchanged from 48 hours prior, within normal fluctuation for that environment. I shifted the marble cover using the hydraulic assist tool I had brought for the purpose, a procedure that took approximately 11 minutes. At 7:04, the interior of the tomb was exposed to the chapel air for the first time since 2007. I set the halogen lamp at 22 degrees of angle. I looked in, and I stepped back. Not from fear. My chest was tight, my hands damp, and my legs had moved without instruction from my brain. 3 steps. My back met the stone pillar behind me. I stood there for, I noted the time later for the report, 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which is an extraordinary length of time to do absolutely nothing when you are conducting a professional procedure with a documented schedule. What I had seen was the hands. Let me tell you what a human body looks like after 12 years inside a sealed zinc coffin in a limestone chamber. The soft tissue is gone. The connective tissue is gone. Adipocere, a waxy, soap-like substance formed from fatty acids, may persist in portions of the remains, particularly in areas of denser subcutaneous fat. But in a sealed, dry environment with limited anaerobic bacterial activity, even adipocere tends to degrade over a decade. What you find, after 12 years, is essentially skeletal remains, with occasional fragments of desiccated organic material. In my 43 documented cases of canonical recognition, with burial ages ranging from 9 to 22 years, I had never found anything substantially different from this picture. Carlo Acutis had been in that tomb for 12 years. His hands were intact. I am going to be precise, because precision is what I owe this account, and what I owe the people who will hear it. When I say intact, I mean that the skin of both hands, the dorsal surface, the palmar surface, the individual fingers, including the webbing between them, was present, continuous, and showed no loss of epidermal layer. The fingers retained their shape. The color was consistent with what I would describe, in technical language, as advanced desiccation with chromatic shift toward amber ochre, not the pale ivory gray of adipocere, not the brown-black of putrefactive residue, but a warm, dry, continuous surface that had clearly maintained structural integrity across the 12 years. I made myself walk back to the tomb. I activated the Sensorion probe and held it 12 centimeters from the dorsal surface of the left hand, without contact. Surface temperature of the external tomb environment at that moment, 17.1 degrees Celsius, consistent with ambient. The reading from the hand surface, 18.4 degrees Celsius, 1.3 degrees above ambient, after 12 years in a sealed tomb. I switched probes. I had a second Sensorion unit in my kit, still in its calibration case, which I had not opened since its last certification on February 28, 2019, 6 weeks prior, well within the 12-month calibration cycle. I took it out, ran the startup sequence, held it at 12 centimeters from the same surface, 18.3 degrees Celsius. The difference between the two instruments? 1/10 of a degree, within expected measurement variance. Which meant the problem was not my instruments. The problem was the hand. 1.3 degrees above the ambient temperature of a sealed stone space is not a dramatic number. In isolation, you could argue condensation effects, localized air current, even instrument placement error. I know those arguments. I have made them myself about other findings on other cases. I am professionally obligated to exhaust them. And I did exhaust them over the next 67 hours in a process I will walk you through in detail. What I cannot tell you, what I could not tell myself, standing there at 7:04 on a Tuesday morning in April 2019, is why, when I looked at those hands, my legs moved backward before my mind had formed a single thought. The science could wait. The legs already knew something. But there was something else about that temperature reading that did not fit the picture I was building. Something that I would only understand 3 weeks later, after Dr. Ferretti ran his own independent analysis and came back to me with a number that changed the entire frame of what we were looking at. Dr. Gianluca Ferretti arrived at 9:03 on April 9th. He was 61 years old, a forensic pathologist with 34 years of experience at the University of Perugia, and he had participated in 2 prior canonical recognitions himself. He was a measured, quiet man who spoke in complete sentences and trusted data. He was also, as he told me when we first shook hands, entirely without religious faith, a detail he offered without apology, the way I might mention a nut allergy. Relevant information stated plainly. He took his own ambient readings. He documented the condition of the tomb surround. Then he leaned over the opening and looked at the remains for a long time, 2 minutes, perhaps 2.5. Then he straightened, pulled a small notebook from his coat pocket, wrote something in it, and closed it without showing me. He looked at me instead. "The integuments of the hands," he said. "Yes," I said. "I'm going to need to run a full surface assessment." "I know." We spent the next 6 hours working through the formal recognition protocol side by side. The canonical postulator observed and documented. A Vatican photographer captured a systematic photographic record under controlled lighting conditions. 4,800 images across the session, using a Nikon D850 with a calibrated gray card for color reference. Every measurement was double documented. My readings, his readings, compared after each subsection. His surface temperature reading on the right-hand dorsal surface at 11:22 in the morning, 18.6 degrees Celsius. Ambient at that moment, 17.2. Differential, 1.4 degrees. 3 hours after my initial reading, the temperature was slightly higher, and the differential was slightly larger. In a normal environment, you expect the opposite. An anomalous local heat signature, if caused by physical factors like trapped residual thermal mass or condensation, should dissipate toward ambient over time as the space equilibrates with the open air. This one was moving the other direction. By 2:45 in the afternoon, with both chapel doors open and the halogen lamp removed to eliminate any possible thermal contribution from my own equipment, I took a third reading. Ambient temperature had risen to 18.9 Celsius, driven by the warming afternoon air flowing in from the open doors. Hand surface temperature? 20.1 degrees Celsius. The differential had grown to 1.2 degrees. Smaller than the morning reading, yes, but the ambient temperature had risen by almost 2 degrees, and the hand temperature had risen by nearly the same amount, tracking upward rather than flattening out toward equilibrium, as it should have done, had it been a passive thermal remnant. The skin surface was not dissipating. It was responding. I want to be careful here because I am a scientist, and this is the place where I most need to be careful. A responding surface temperature is not impossible in organic remains. There are fermentation processes in certain moisture conditions that generate localized heat. There are fungal colonizations that produce measurable endothermic reactions. I documented both possibilities in my working notes. I collected 3 surface samples using a sterile swab protocol, 22 millimeter contact area. One from the left dorsal hand, one from the right, one from the wrist anterior surface, and sent them to the mycology and microbiology laboratory at the University of Perugia for analysis. Results were promised within 14 working days. 14 working days. 2 weeks and 4 days, if I am being exact. During which I stayed in Assisi, in a rented room on the Via Fontebella, 200 meters from the sanctuary, because I could not leave. Because Dr. Ferretti and I had agreed, separately and then together, that this case required continuous monitoring. And because that evening, sitting alone in my room with my field notebook open to a blank page, I reached into the inner breast pocket of my work jacket and held the small brown envelope with Carlo's 4 words on the outside, and felt, for the first time in 13 years, that I was getting closer to understanding what it meant. I did not open it. Antonia had said, "When you know what it means." I did not know yet, but I was closer. I was also, that same evening, starting to understand a secondary problem, one that had nothing to do with temperature. It had to do with the face. The face was a separate issue, and in some ways a harder one, because it was more visible to more people, and therefore more difficult to contain within the controlled environment. Dr. Ferretti and I had discussed the hands in technical language that left room, however narrowing, for physical explanations. The face was harder to discuss in that register. Carlo Acutis died at 15 years old. His face in photographs taken in 2006, the weeks before his death, shows a young boy with a broad forehead, a slightly prominent nose, a direct expression that reads as alert and unbothered by the camera. He had a habit, according to his mother, of looking straight into lenses without self-consciousness. What was in the tomb was not skeletal. The facial structure retained soft tissue in a state of preservation that, by the standard scale I use for documentation, a 7-point desiccation scale derived from the protocol developed by Matt and Mastwick at Leiden in 1995, I would place at 2.4, which means substantial preservation of soft tissue with surface desiccation, retaining recognizable structural form. After 12 years, in a sealed zinc coffin, in a limestone chamber in Umbria. The Leiden scale, applied to the 43 cases in my professional documentation, showed an average score of 5.8 at 12 years of burial under comparable environmental conditions. The range was 4.9 to 6.3. Carlo scored 2.4. Those numbers mean something specific. A score of 5.8 means you are largely looking at skeletal remains with some organic fragments. A score of 2.4 means you are looking at a preserved face. The gap between 2.4 and 4.9, the lowest I had ever previously recorded at this burial age, was not a subtle variation. It was a different category of outcome. I filed a supplementary observation to my technical report on April 14th, 5 days into continuous monitoring. The supplementary note read, in part, "The state of preservation of the remains, particularly the integuments of the hands and face, falls outside the statistical range established by this examiner's prior documentation and falls outside the published literature on expected decomposition rates for the described burial conditions. No environmental, chemical, or biological mechanism identified to date fully accounts for the observed differential from expected outcome." That is the most precise sentence I know how to write about what I found. I am a scientist. I do not write sentences like that lightly. That sentence cost me 4 days of alternative explanations before I would let myself put it on the page. The microbiology results from Perugia arrived on April 29th. Dr. Ferretti called me at 7:40 in the morning. I was already awake, already in the chapel for my 6 a.m. monitoring check. "The swabs are clean," he said. Clean. No fermentative organisms. No fungal colonization producing endothermic activity. No unusual bacterial profile. The surface of the hands, microbiologically speaking, was essentially inert. No active biological process that could account for the temperature differential. My mouth was dry. "The temperature last night," I said. "I have it here. 20.3 degrees at 11 p.m. Ambient was 17.8. Differential, 2.5 degrees. The gap had been growing for 20 days. If this has moved something in you already, and I believe it has, because you would not still be here if it hadn't, I want to offer you something before I go further. I prepared a novena to Carlo Acutis, completely free, 9 days of prayer drawn from his own words and his devotion to the Eucharist, so that you too can bring whatever you carry inside to this young man who seems unwilling to stay quiet. It is in the description, the first link right below this video. Download it, pray it over these 9 days for whoever needs it most in your life. But before I tell you what I'm asking you to carry into that prayer right now, I have to go back to what we found in the weeks that followed, because the temperature readings were only the first of the 3 things. And what Dr. Ferretti found in his independent analysis was something none of us had framed correctly until then. Dr. Ferretti had not been idle during the 20 days of monitoring. While I was managing the surface temperature protocol, he had been conducting his own parallel investigation, something he had not mentioned to me until the morning of the Perugia call, because he's the kind of scientist who does not show his work until it is finished. He came to the chapel that afternoon with a folder of printed data and sat down on the stone bench along the north wall. He opened the folder. He turned it so I could see the first page. It was a comparative analysis. He had pulled the documentation from 8 previously recognized incorrupt or partially preserved remains from Italy and Spain, all beatification cause cases from the past 40 years, all with documented environmental parameters and preservation scores. He had plotted them on a scatter graph against burial age and preservation score. The 8 points formed a clear downward cluster. More years, lower preservation, as expected. Then he had added a 9th point, Carlo's. Carlo's point was not in the cluster. It was not near the cluster. It sat in the upper left quadrant of the graph, low burial age, very high preservation, but at a distance from the nearest historical case that when I asked Ferretti to calculate the standard deviations, he looked at me and said, 4.3. 4.3 standard deviations from the nearest comparable case in the published record. In statistics, anything beyond 3 standard deviations is classified as an extreme outlier, something that should occur by chance fewer than 3 times in 1,000. 4.3 standard deviations is not a term most working scientists ever have occasion to use. It is a number that means this did not happen by any mechanism we can account for within the model. He said it quietly, the way men who have spent 30 years around death learn to say things. I have never produced a number like this in my career. I looked at the graph for a long time. What do you do with it? I write it down, he said, exactly as it is, and I submitted. There was something in the folder he had not yet shown me. He turned to the third page. It was a different kind of analysis, not a comparative scatter, but a progression chart. He had taken the temperature differentials I had been recording twice daily since April 9th and plotted them across the 20 days. A normal dissipation curve should slope downward and flatten towards zero as the open tomb equilibrated with the chapel environment. Carlo's curve did not slope downward. It was ascending, slowly, irregularly, but unmistakably ascending. 20 data points, each one slightly higher than the day before. On April 28th, the night before the Perugia call, the differential had been 2.3 degrees. The morning of the call, 2.5. By the time I left Assisi in mid-May, after 37 days of continuous monitoring, the highest differential I recorded was 2.9 degrees Celsius, taken on May 6th at 3:14 in the morning, during my overnight monitoring session. I need to explain why I was in a chapel at 3:14 in the morning. I need to explain also what I heard. Nothing dramatic, not a voice, not a vision, not the kind of thing that breaks a scientist's framework the way a hammer breaks a tile. What I heard on the night of May 5th going into May 6th was silence of a quality I had not previously encountered in 27 years of working in ancient churches. Stone buildings have an acoustic signature. They breathe. Thermal expansion and contraction of the masonry produces a constant low-frequency creaking, almost inaudible but measurable with a sensitive microphone, which I had deployed as part of my environmental documentation array. The Testo data logger was recording sound pressure levels continuously. Between 2:41 and 3:27 on the morning of May 6th, the background acoustic level in the chapel dropped from an average of 22 decibels, typical for that environment, to 14 decibels. A drop of 8 decibels in ambient acoustic noise in an enclosed stone space, without any corresponding change in wind or external sound data from the outdoor sensor, is anomalous. Not supernatural, anomalous. A word I had now used about this tomb so many times it had worn smooth. But this is the detail that planted itself in my mind and did not leave. The acoustic drop began at 2:41. The highest temperature differential I recorded in 37 days, 2.9 degrees, was measured at 3:14, within the same 33-minute window. Both data streams, independent of each other, produced their most extreme values at the same time on the same night. Coincidence is a word I use with precision. A coincidence requires two unconnected variables to intersect by chance. For that to be the case here, I needed to be confident that acoustic level and thermal behavior of the remains were genuinely independent variables. The problem was that I could not demonstrate they were. I could not demonstrate they were connected either. I had two anomalies, a 33-minute window and no causal mechanism in either direction. I added both to the supplementary report. I underlined the time correlation. I submitted it to the postulator on May 17, 2019, along with 47 pages of data tables, the Perugia microbiology results, Dr. Ferretti's scatter analysis, and my own temperature progression chart. I drove north out of Assisi on May 18th with my equipment in the back of the car and the small brown envelope in my jacket pocket. And I thought, I still do not know what those 4 words mean. What I knew about Carlo Acutis before that assignment in 2019 was essentially nothing. He was a teenager who had died of leukemia in 2006 and whose beatification cause was underway. He had been born in London on May 3, 1991, to Italian parents. He had grown up in Milan. He had, according to the initial case summary I had been sent, spent a significant portion of his short life documenting Eucharistic miracles from around the world and publishing them on a website. He had received his first Holy Communion at 7, 2 years earlier than the standard catechetical preparation, because he had asked to, and the priest had agreed. He had gone to daily Mass from the age of 7 until his death at 15. That was the file, a devout boy who built a website. It did not prepare me for what I found when I began to actually read. I came home from Assisi to Bologna on May 18th and spent the following 3 weeks in something close to methodical obsession. I requested access to the full cause documentation, the positio, the collected testimonies, the medical analyses from the first and second miracles under examination. I read through something close to 1,400 pages over those 3 weeks, in the evenings after my regular conservation work, making notes in a spiral notebook that I still have. The first miracle formally accepted, Mateus Costa Menezes, born in Campo Grande, Brazil, in 2000. In 2013, at age 13, he fell on a school trip and suffered a traumatic pancreatic injury. Diagnosis: grade 4 pancreatic laceration with complete duct disruption, documented by CT scan at the Hospital Regional de Mato Grosso do Sul on September 3, 2013. The surgical team's initial assessment called for emergency intervention and anticipated a minimum 8-week hospitalization with uncertain long-term outcomes. His family began praying to Carlo Acutis on September 4th, using a prayer card they had received from a local parish that had displayed the Eucharistic Miracles exhibition, Carlo's traveling exhibition, which had been shown in over 35 countries by that point. On September 5th, a follow-up CT scan was ordered before surgery. The pancreatic laceration was gone. Radiologist Dr. Peter Strapp, Paulo Henrique Ferreira at the same hospital documented no evidence of the previously identified grade 4 laceration, ductal anatomy intact, no evidence of prior injury. The original CT and the follow-up CT are separated by 36 hours. The injury present in one is absent in the other. No surgery had been performed. No medical intervention had been administered beyond standard supportive care. I read that documentation 3 times. I am not a radiologist, but I know how to read a technical finding, and the finding says what it says. And then there was this. In the testimony section of the positio, a statement from Antonia Salzano, Carlo's mother, recorded in Rome on November 22, 2016. She was describing the last days of Carlo's life at San Gerardo Hospital in Monza in October 2006. In the statement, she described Carlo's state of mind in the days before his death, his continued insistence on going to Mass, even from his hospital bed, carried there in a wheelchair while undergoing chemotherapy. She described his serenity, which multiple witnesses attested to. And then she described a specific exchange. On October 9, 2006, 3 days before he died, Carlo had said to her, she quoted this from memory, but with the precision of someone who had repeated it to herself 10,000 times in 10 years. He said, "Mama, do not worry about me. But there is a woman, a scientist, who works with churches, and she will need to hear this. The proof will be in the hands." Antonia had recorded this in her personal diary on October 9, 2006. The diary entry was included in the positio as a supporting document. The original handwritten page was photographed. The Italian reads, "Una donna, una scienziata che lavora con le chiese. La prova sarà nelle mani." A woman, a scientist who works with churches. The proof will be in the hands. I read that sentence at 11:23 p.m. on June 4, 2019, sitting at my kitchen table in Bologna with a cup of tea that had gone cold. I read it 4 times. And then I reached into the pocket of my jacket, which was hanging on the back of my chair, and I took out the small brown envelope, and I held it. Antonia had given me the envelope in February 2006. I had met her briefly 3 months before Carlo's death at a conservation consultation at a church in Milan. She had been volunteering there with a parish project, cataloging donations, and we had spoken for perhaps 20 minutes. She had told me about her son, about his website on Eucharistic miracles, about his faith. And as I was leaving, she had pressed the small envelope into my hand and said quietly, "Carlo asked me to give this to someone who works with sacred things and doesn't believe yet. I think it's you. Don't open it until you know what it means." I did not know what it meant in February 2006. I did not know in April 2019 when I was standing over the tomb. But sitting at my kitchen table on June 4th, 2019, with the October 9th diary entry visible on my laptop screen, I thought, I am getting very close. I did not open it that night because I did not yet have the name. And the name was the last piece. If you downloaded the novena I mentioned earlier, you already understand why prayer sometimes feels less like asking and more like paying attention, like learning to read a message that was always there. If you haven't downloaded it yet, it is still in the description, the first link below this video. Pray it for whoever is on your mind right now, whoever needs what Carlo Acutis seems to offer, which is mostly the evidence that this is all real. And if these testimonies are gathering something in you, this channel is where I keep collecting them. But what I found in the following weeks changed even the way I understood my own past, and the name came from somewhere I never expected. The name came from Assisi, not from any document, not from the Positio, not from Antonia. It came from a conversation with the sanctuary's archivist, a Franciscan friar named Fra Benedetto Lana, who had been caring for the records of that church for 31 years. I went back to Assisi in September 2019, 4 months after my first visit, officially to complete a follow-up monitoring session and submit my final temperature data to the postulator. But I also wanted to see Fra Benedetto, because in my June reading of the Positio, I had found a footnote reference to a prior event at the same sanctuary, something that had happened in October 2007, the year after Carlo was buried there, which had been briefly documented and then apparently set aside. Fra Benedetto was 73. He had the careful eyes of an archivist and the unhurried way of speaking that comes from spending decades in places where silence is the default. We sat in the archive room, stone walls, wooden shelves, the smell of old paper and beeswax, and he told me what had happened on October 12, 2007, exactly 1 year after Carlo's death. A group of pilgrims from the Philippines, 23 people, traveling as a parish group from Manila, had come to pray at the tomb. This was not uncommon. The tomb had been attracting visitors from the first months after the burial. The group's leader, a woman named Corazon Reyes, he spelled the name for me, wrote it in my notebook, pressed the pen into the paper, was 64 years old and had traveled to Assisi specifically because her granddaughter in Manila had been diagnosed 3 months earlier with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, the same category of disease that had killed Carlo. Same disease family, different subtype. Corazon had been praying at the tomb for 40 minutes when she reported that her phone, which she had set to silent, suddenly displayed an image she had not opened. The image was a photograph of her granddaughter, which she had saved to her phone 4 months prior. The photograph showed the girl in a hospital bed, looking at the camera, and the girl was smiling. Corazon had not looked at that photograph since the day she saved it. The screen had come on by itself, in her pocket, displaying that image at that specific moment. Fra Benedetto told me this without drama. He had interviewed Corazon himself the following day, in this same room, with another friar present as a witness. He had documented it in the archive log. I asked him, "What happened to the granddaughter?" He opened a filing cabinet, one of those old olive green metal ones with a sticky bottom drawer, and produced a single sheet of paper. A photocopy of a letter from a hospital in Manila dated March 14, 2008, 5 months after Corazon's visit. I cannot read Tagalog, but the medical terminology was in English. No evidence of residual disease on follow-up bone marrow biopsy, March 12, 2008. Patient considered in complete remission. The girl's name was not on the copy he showed me. Privacy, he said, but the date was there, March 12, 2008. I wrote the name Corazon Reyes in my notebook, and beneath it the date March 12th, 2008, and I sat with that for a moment. Then I said to Fra Benedetto, "Did you report this to the dicastery?" He said, "I reported everything to the dicastery. In 2007, they received it and told me to continue documenting." There was a file, 12 years old, sitting in this archive, documented, waiting. The dicastery had it. I had not seen it in the Positio documentation because it was from 2007, before the cause had formally opened, and it had been filed separately as a preliminary devotional report rather than a canonical miraculous event. It was not a formally examined miracle. It was a documented instance that had been received and noted and put on a shelf. I walked back to the sanctuary in the early afternoon. I sat in the lower chapel, 15 meters from the tomb, and wrote in my notebook for an hour. The problem I kept turning over was this. I had now been given, by 3 entirely independent sources, my own temperature data, Antonia's diary from October 9th, 2006, and Fra Benedetto's 2007 archive, 3 convergent lines of evidence that all pointed toward the same conclusion. But they each needed the other 2 to make full sense. My temperature data was anomalous, but potentially explicable. Antonia's diary was specific, but unfalsifiable. Fra Benedetto's file was documented, but incomplete. Alone, each one could be set aside. Together, they formed a shape. And I still have the envelope. I still did not know what the 4 words meant, but I was now 3 components into a puzzle that seemed to have exactly 4 pieces. The 4th piece required something to happen to me first. This is the part that is hardest to tell in the order it happened, because it involves a period of my life that intersects with the pandemic years in a way that I did not, at the time, read as connected to any of this. In retrospect, the connection is not subtle, but I am a scientist, and hindsight is a treacherous tool, so I will give you the sequence and let you judge. In January 2020, I began experiencing intermittent vertigo, the kind that drops you to the floor without warning. On February 18th, 2020, an MRI at the Policlinico Sant'Orsola in Bologna identified a meningioma, a tumor of the meningeal tissue, located at the posterior base of the skull, measuring 21 millimeters in its largest dimension. Grade 1, which is the least aggressive classification, but 21 millimeters in that location is not nothing. The neurosurgeon, Dr. Caterina Viani, scheduled a full assessment and told me that the primary risk was not the tumor itself, but its location. Resection in that area carried a 5 to 8% risk of significant hearing impairment and a 3% risk of damage to the facial nerve. I was 51 years old. I had no partner, no children, no one in Bologna who was my person. I had my work, I had my instruments, I had a brown envelope in my jacket pocket that I had been carrying for 14 years. The pandemic lockdown began in Italy on March 10th, 2020. My surgery, scheduled for March 19th, was postponed. It was postponed again in May, and again in July. The tumor was grade 1, not immediately life-threatening, which placed me in the lower priority surgical queue during a period when the Italian health system was managing a crisis of extraordinary scale. By August, the first had been postponed 3 times, and the follow-up MRI on August 3rd showed that the tumor had grown to 24 millimeters. Still grade 1, but growing. I am going to tell you exactly what happened on October 12th, 2020, without embellishment and without evasion. I was at home in Bologna. It was a Monday. The date mattered to me in a purely factual way. October 12th was the 14th anniversary of Carlo's death, and I was by then well aware of that date because of the case file I had been living with for 18 months. I was not in a church. I was not doing anything devotional. I was at my desk reviewing conservation photographs from a project in Ravenna when at 9:47 in the morning I experienced a vertigo episode severe enough to put me on the floor. I sat on the floor with my back against the desk, and I did not try to get up because I had learned not to try to get up during these episodes. I was on the floor for 16 minutes. I know because I checked the clock when I sat down and again when I stood. During those 16 minutes, I had nothing to do but exist in my body and wait. And at some point during those 16 minutes, I cannot give you a precise time because I was not watching the clock continuously, I reached into the pocket of my jacket, which was hanging on the chair above me, and I took out the envelope. 4 words on the outside, in blue ballpoint pen. Carlo had dictated them to Antonia in early 2006, before I even met her, before he knew my name. They were, "Quando sai dove?" When you know where it is. I opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded sheet of plain white paper. On the paper, in the same blue ballpoint handwriting, were 3 lines. I will read them to you exactly as they were written. La scienziata troverà la mani. La prova è nel differenziale. Bologna, 12 October. Guarira. The scientist will find the hands. The proof is in the differential. Bologna, October 12th. She will be healed. I sat on the floor for a long time after reading those lines. The vertigo had stopped. I noticed that the vertigo had stopped, and I filed that fact away in the same part of my brain that had been filing anomalous data for 18 months, and I did not allow myself to make the connection immediately because I am a scientist, and I do not make connections until I have ruled out alternatives. My surgery was finally scheduled for November 3rd, 2020. The pre-surgical MRI on October 28th was performed at the same facility by the same radiologist who had performed the previous 3 scans. The radiologist, Dr. Marco Pellegrini, called Dr. Vianney that afternoon. Dr. Vianney called me. "Your MRI results," she said. "Tell me." "The tumor has decreased. 24 millimeters in August. The current measurement is 16.2 millimeters. That is not a measurement error. I've had Dr. Pellegrini recheck the slices twice. It is a reduction of 7.8 millimeters over 11 weeks. Grade 1 meningiomas occasionally stabilize. They very rarely shrink spontaneously, and when they do, it is usually measured in fractions of a millimeter over years, not in millimeters over weeks." Dr. Vianney told me she was consulting with 2 colleagues before proceeding to surgery, given the changed picture. The surgery was rescheduled for January 2021, pending a further follow-up scan in December. The December 14th scan showed 16.0 millimeters, essentially stable from October 28th. I did not submit this as a miracle. I want to be absolutely clear about that. A spontaneous grade 1 meningioma reduction in a 51-year-old woman during a period of extreme stress is unusual, but not impossible, and I do not have the right to declare causes for events in my own body. What I have is the data, the timing, the paper in my hand. The date on the paper? October 12th. The city on the paper? Bologna. The description on the paper? A woman. A scientist who works with churches. The proof is in the hands. The proof is in the differential. The differential, 2.9 degrees, maximum, measured on May 6, 2019 at 3:14 in the morning. An acoustic anomaly in the same 33-minute window. A Leiden scale score of 2.4 against a population range of 4.9 to 6.3. 3 datasets, 1 envelope, 1 date. I called Antonia Salzano that evening. I told her what was in the envelope. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I know. He told me what he wrote before he gave it to me to pass along. He said, she will know when to open it." And then she said something else, something that I have thought about every day since. She said, "He prayed for you every day from February until October, you know, by name. Except I never told him your name." She paused. "He called you the scientist with the churches. He said he had met you somewhere, but he never told me where." Carlo died in October 2006. I had met Antonia once, briefly, in February 2006. I had never met Carlo. I have no record, no memory, no documentation of any encounter between that 15-year-old boy and myself. And yet, where am I today? I am 55 years old. The meningioma, at its last measurement on September 2nd, 2024, measured 11.3 millimeters. It has been shrinking in small increments since the October 2020 reduction, and Dr. Viani has now reclassified my case to watchful waiting with annual imaging rather than surgical intervention. I gave a formal testimony before the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints in Rome on March 4th, 2021. Testimony regarding the technical findings from the canonical recognition of 2019, submitted as part of the ongoing documentation for the beatification cause. I attended the beatification of Carlo Acutis on October 10th, 2020, in St. Peter's Square, 6 days before I received Dr. Viani's call about the October 28th scan, though I did not yet know that was coming. I stood in the square and heard Pope Francis speak Carlo's name, and I had the envelope in my pocket, now opened, the paper folded back inside it, and I thought about a 15-year-old boy who had apparently been praying for a scientist who worked with churches before she knew she needed it. On September 7th, 2025, in the same square, Pope Leo XIV canonized Carlo Acutis before more than 200,000 people. He is now Saint Carlo Acutis, the first millennial saint, the patron of the internet, the young man who said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven, and who built a website to show the world that heaven was not an abstraction. I was not in the square for the canonization. I watched it on a small laptop in the archive room of a church in Ravenna, where I was working on a fresco restoration project. The halogen lamp angled at precisely 22 degrees, the Sensorion probe sitting in its calibration case beside me, everything as it always is when I begin work in a sacred space. When the name was spoken, I stopped what I was doing and sat still for a moment. The stone walls of the archive room were very quiet. That quiet, I know its quality now. I have measured it. 14 decibels in those moments, 8 below the ambient baseline. I think about the hands. I think about them the way you think about something you have looked at so directly and for so long that it has become part of your inner landscape. The intact fingers, the amber ochre surface, the differential of 2.9 degrees on a May morning at 3:14 in a chapel no one else was in. The hands of a boy who had spent 8 years going to daily mass, receiving what he called his highway, until a disease that was diagnosed on October 2nd, 2006, and killed him 10 days later at 15 years old, decided to take that highway from him. He made it easier for everyone, his mother said. He told them not to grieve. He told them the truth would come out in time. He handed someone an envelope. I have tried many times to find the precise language for what those hands changed in me. I am not good at that kind of language. It is not my instrument. What I can say is this. I went into that tomb in April 2019 as someone who had spent 27 years measuring the decay of matter and trusting the measurement. I came out of it as someone who trusts the measurement just as much and who now also knows that the measurements, in certain cases, point somewhere the measurements cannot go. That is not comfortable for a scientist. It is also not, I have found, something I can unknow. The data is in the report. The report is with the Dicastery. The temperature charts, the Ferretti scatter analysis, the Leiden scale scores, the microbiology clean swabs, the acoustic log, the October 28th MRI from Dr. Viani's practice, the translation of the envelope contents, the date October 12th, and the city Bologna written in a 15-year-old's handwriting in February 2006, 8 months before he died. All of it is filed. All of it is documented. All of it, as far as I can judge, is true. The Eucharist was his highway to heaven. He said it plainly, the way he said most things, without hedging and without performance. And I think I think as a scientist who has looked at evidence and followed it where it goes, which is what I have always done, I think that when he took that highway, he left traces, measurable ones, ones that show up on instruments and in data tables and in the unexplained reduction of a 24-millimeter tumor over 11 weeks in a city he named on a piece of paper 8 months before he died. Traces of heaven are everywhere. He knew that. He spent 8 years documenting the places where those traces were undeniable. His website, his exhibition, his archive of 160 documented Eucharistic cases from across the world, organized with the systematic thoroughness of a scientist and the patience of someone who understood that evidence, properly gathered, is its own argument. I am still gathering evidence. I go to churches, I carry my instruments. The Sensorian probe is calibrated. The halogen lamp is angled at 22 degrees. I do my work. And some mornings, in the quiet of an early chapel before anyone else arrives, the acoustic monitor drops to 14 decibels, and the surface reads a degree or two above ambient, and I stand there with my clipboard, and I think, hello. If this testimony has stayed with you, if it has settled somewhere you did not expect, I want to ask you one thing before you close this video. Subscribe to this channel and share it with someone who needs to hear it. We keep gathering here on Traces of Heaven because there are stories like this one that the world does not know yet, and they deserve to be told with the same care and precision that they deserve. And if you want to carry something of Carlo's story into the next 9 days, the free novena is waiting for you in the description. The first link, right below this video. Pray it, share it, bring it to whoever is most on your mind. Carlo said the Eucharist was his highway to heaven. The traces of heaven are everywhere. You only have to know how to look.